Hey class, Prof JC here. We're diving in on our journey to mental models. Mental models, welcome to week 5 as we talk about creative destruction and the law of entropy. Or maybe I should say it this way, the law of entropy and creative destruction. We're going to talk about it in that order as well. So let me share my screen with you. Okay, so here's what we're talking about. We're actually a little bit too far into here, so let's go back. Okay, so remember we're talking about mental models, and just a quick repeat about what mental models are. Okay, we've talked about this before. It's a way of thinking, and here's the deal: every single one of us have mental models. The question is, are the current mental models you have, are they serving you well? So here's what a mental model is. Okay, let me make myself a little smaller here. So here's, again, it says the simplest explanation of mental models. Typically, we go from information to making a decision. We go from information to making a decision. And actually, I would add this, and I actually, I added this to the slide here. Typically, what happens is we take in information. That information leads to some kind of emotion. That then leads to making a decision. Information, emotion, decision. Okay. The problem with that is we make emotion-based decisions. And I know that you've done it before. I certainly have done it before, okay? And every time, almost every time I've made decisions, probably the same for you, every time you've made decisions that are based right here on emotions, it leads to a poor decision. Mental models are another way of seeing the world, right? So we take out the emotions, we go from information to mental model to decision. Okay, so we go from, I don't know, whatever it may be. Do I buy this car or do I not? And then maybe you pick up the mental model of long-term thinking and you say, well, really, when I think long-term, the goal that I have is to purchase a house, right? And I need to save $50,000, or you live in California, you need to save $100,000 for a 10% down, right, on a home, right? And so you want to buy this car, though, but then you realize, okay, that's your emotion speaking right there. I want this car. It's a really nice car, but you start realizing you've got maybe you got a wife, you got a kids, you've got a husband, you got kids at the time, and you realize that what's most important is to make a good decision. So a mental model of long-term thinking says, well, I want this car right now, but this car will still be here in 10 years. What's really important for me is to make sure I build a really great, a safe home, a good home for my kids. So that helps you make a good decision. That's just a small example, okay? So mental models. So let's talk tonight about the law of entropy, and what this means, okay? So the ultimate definition of entropy is simply this: gradual decline, okay? And the law of entropy states this, that the entropy is always at work. I want you to think about your own self, your own body, right? I'm getting ready to turn 44 years of age, and I see in myself, I used to be vibrant. I used to be, I've shared this before. I'm getting over the sickness that I had, and it's because for years, and I was thinking about this the other day, probably even decades, I've stayed up late. It's just what I do. I get up early, and on a really good day, if I'm able to take a long nap in the afternoon, I do that, and then I stay up late till sometimes 1 or 2, 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning sometimes. I like to work. I like to, I'm kind of a night owl, but it's not working for me anymore. It is not working, and my body is shutting down even more, right? Because of this right here, gradual decline. And here's the deal, right? Once you get in your 40s, you start to see it more. And I don't know if anybody on the call is there yet, but once you get there, you'll start to see it, right? Everything is in a state of decline. I want you to think about anything you have. If you've got a book, if you've got your car, the moment you drive it off the lot, right, it loses a ton of value. And that's because you're going to drive it around and you're going to take a lot of value off. It's just, this is how the world works. Okay, gradual decline is always at work. Now, in closed or isolated systems, the process of entropy is accelerated. So I want to explain this to you, okay? And then we'll get to this idea of creative destruction, okay? A very important mental model for you. But let's talk about this idea of isolated, closed, and open systems. This is key to you understanding, okay? And we'll get this in a second, why this is important for you to understand for your leadership and for your business, okay? So here are 3 different systems that we have in life. You've got an isolated, right here, you got an isolated system. So an isolated system is one in which nothing comes in and nothing comes out. It's totally isolated. So the best example that I always think about when I talk about this is, let's use a home, okay? So let's say you have a home on your block, wherever you live, and that home is totally isolated. That means the windows are closed. That means the doors are closed. Nothing gets in, nothing gets out. Okay, it's completely isolated. There's no breeze coming in. There's just nothing from the outside can get. It is a totally isolated system. The question I have for you is simply this: how long until everything in that house begins to smell and begins to disintegrate? Right. So picture that house having couches and beds and furniture and all the stuff that homes have, and carpet and paint, and now it's a totally isolated system. How long does everything in that system last? Well, not very long, right? Can you imagine living in a home like that? How long would people last in an isolated system? Nothing from the outside coming in, right? I mean, just from from a practical standpoint, if you're living in that home and you can't go outside and buy food, you can't go outside and buy water, right? You're living in an isolated system. Everything's going to die within a short amount of time. That's an isolated system. A closed system is one where you have inputs, but you have no outputs. Okay. So when I think about this, I think about the kind of home, okay, that has, a person that's lived there over 30 years and they constantly buy things, but they never get rid of anything else. Right. So this is kind of the hoarder. This is the person that keeps collecting, keeps bringing new items into the house, keeps bringing stuff in and bringing stuff in and bringing stuff in, and they're hoarding, but nothing gets out of it. Now, what happens in a home like that? Right? You do have some inputs, right? You got a door that opens. Maybe you have some windows that open. You've got people that are obviously bringing stuff in, but nothing is leaving. Right? In that kind of system, you're going to see death and decay much quicker as well, right? Can you imagine what that home's going to smell like in like 10 years, right? Now move, excuse me, now move to an open system, and you've got things that are going in and things that are going out. So again, I want you to picture that same house. Okay, you got the isolated where nothing comes in and nothing goes out. There's going to be death and decay and rot within a short amount of time. You've got a closed system where things are coming in but nothing's going out. It's going to take a little bit longer, but there's still going to be death and decay and rot. In an open system, it's much different. You've got items that are coming in and items that are going out. So you're constantly bringing in the new, constantly getting rid of the old. Constantly. Now, what kind of home do you want to live in? If you had to choose between these homes, what kind of home do you want to live in? Right? Absolutely. You've probably chose like me. You want to live in the open home. New furniture that comes in maybe every couple of years, a new paint job, obviously new food coming in, and you're getting rid of stuff, right? You're cleaning out the garage. There's just this constant change, right? That's what. Now think about a business as well. For those of you who run businesses, are you running an isolated business, right? Typically not. I'm right. That's pretty tough. If you are running an isolated business, you understand literally just by its definition, you're going to have the death of a company within a short amount of time. But maybe you say, well, I'm not necessarily doing that. Maybe you're running a closed business, but you're not exactly sure that you are, right? So you got a lot of information coming in, but nothing exits, right? So this looks like a team. Let me just give an example of a team right here, right? You've got a team and you're constantly bringing in new people, new ideas, but you're not getting rid of the old. Right? This is going to lead to decay. At the very worst, this is going to lead to plateauing, right? And I've seen this in organizations before where they can't get rid of all the old stuff. They get attached to it. Maybe it's people on the team, people in the organization that are like, well, they've been around for 40 years and, well, we don't want to get rid of them there, but they're not adding any value anymore, right? It's not about people who've been around a long time. I want to make that clear. And it's definitely not about age, right? It's not about that at all, but it's about everything in the organizations needs to be adding value to it, needs to be creating growth and renewal and evolution. But if they're not, we just keep them around. Why? Because nobody wants to make the hard call, right? So what's going to happen there? Eventually, that business is going to lead to death and decay as well. What you really want is an open system, right? So I want you to think about a team that you've led before. If you're constantly having just people coming in and nothing leaving, or information coming in, but you're not getting rid of old information, you're still using technology from 1980 when now it's 2023, right? Because you haven't gotten rid of everything. That's all death and decay. What you want is an open system. Okay, in an open system, death and decay happens much at a much shorter rate, at a much lower rate than what it would do in an isolated or closed system, okay? So I hope that makes sense there. Isolated, closed, open system, total death in an isolated system, quick death in an isolated system, slower death in a closed system, and at least over here in an open system, right? Now, obviously, the universe is always decaying, right? The law of entropy is for everything, right? So we're always in a state of decay. But in an open system, you're going to hold off that death and decay longer term. So here is law of entropy as a mental model, and here's what it states over here, okay? When something, anything, is in a state of accelerated decline, you are witnessing a closed or isolated system. We just talked about that. You must ask yourself the question. Now, this goes back to why we're talking about today, why it's a leadership mental model. What new information, new people, new experiences could be added to make this something, anything, an open system? Okay, so as you're working through your leadership and as you're trying to figure out where the company is going, the question I would ask you, are you working in an isolated system? Is your leadership causing it to be an isolated system, or is it causing it to be a closed system? You can't get rid of stuff. You can't get rid of ideas. You can't get rid of technology, old technology. You can't get rid of people who are no longer adding value to your team, to your organization, right? So the question you have to ask, right, is this idea of what new information, what new people, what new experiences could be added to make something. Now, here's what I would add to this that I didn't put in here. And what old information, and I don't mean old people. I don't mean that in terms of age, but what are people who've been around for a while who aren't adding value? And what about experiences need to be taken away, right, to make this system work? Okay, so that's the law of entropy. The way you slow down the law of entropy, you're incessantly getting rid of the old and you're incessantly bringing in the new, which leads us to this idea of creative destruction. Creative destruction is the dismantling of long-standing practices, okay, in order to make way for innovation, and is seen as a driving force of capitalism. Okay, so whether you like it or not, the United States of America is a capitalist nation, and here's how it happens, right? We dismantle long-standing practices. So things that worked in the 80s are not going to work in the 90s, probably not going to work in the 2000s, and definitely not going to work in 2023, right? So we have to constantly be getting rid of them in order to make way for innovation. What's innovation? At a very basic form, innovation is just bringing something new. And usually I share this with most of my classes. People tend to think of people like Steve Jobs, great innovators, great creators, that there's these incredible people and I can't do anything like them. The reality is that Steve Jobs didn't create very much. He innovated. And most of the great creators of today, most of the people who are doing big things in society today, it's not so much that they're creating anything new. They're taking what's already there and they're innovating on it. I want you to think about Jeff Bezos, right? He knew that the internet was there and he knew that we had bookstores. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember, but I remember back, and I did this a lot when I was in the military, wherever I went to, I'd find a good bookstore. I love to read. If you could see my office here, you'd see all my books on the wall here. So I would find all these places where I could go and I would just sit and do books. And that's how you had to get books back in the day. Libraries, I love spending time in libraries, or you'd had to go to like Barnes and Nobles or something like that. Jeff Bezos saw the internet, he saw books, and he said, how about I put the two of these together and I get books to people much faster? That's innovation, right? So you see what's already out there, or you see what's coming. He could see what the internet was going to become. He knew people like books, and that's where he started. And now most of us buy so many things on Amazon.com, right? So he didn't create anything. He didn't create the internet. He didn't create books, but he put the two together and he brought innovation. Now, what he would tell you, what he's continued to do is continue to innovate, right? So what if he just found the internet and found books and he was just still selling bookstores, right? He was just had an online bookstore. Do you think Jeff Bezos and Amazon would be what it is today? Absolutely not. They've had to innovate, right? So it worked with books, and they tried other products. Now they've got grocery stores. You can buy clothes. You can buy almost anything on Amazon. I was looking at kayaks the other day. I'm trying to look for a tandem kayak. I could buy one at Amazon.com, right? There's almost anything that you want on there because of this idea of creative destruction, incessantly getting rid of the old, incessantly making room for the new. So here's some examples in the world that we live in. The internet is perhaps the most all-encompassing example of creative destruction, where the losers were not only retail clerks and their employers, but also bank tellers, secretaries, travel agents. I don't mean that these are losers as people. What I mean is that in the marketplace, they lost the game, right, to the internet. The mobile internet added many more losers, from taxi cab drivers to map makers, right? So look at these industries out there, right? I remember a day when the yellow cab was what you had. And thank goodness for Uber, because I remember, I was up in Spokane, Washington last week, and I had to catch a 5:11 a.m. flight to get back to San Diego. I had a meeting that afternoon I need to be back for. And if I remember the day of the yellow cab, because that's all that there was out there was yellow cab. You could call in a yellow cab, and you'd have to wait. They either have to be open, or you'd have to wait around for an hour and a half. Sometimes I remember those days back when I was a kid, waiting for an hour and a half for the taxi cab to get there. It doesn't work that way anymore. I reserved an Uber 2 days ahead of time because I knew I had to be at the airport. airport at that time, and I was able to have someone there at the hotel at 3:30 a.m. Took me 20 minutes, to get down the street to the airport, and it all worked out, right? That's how it works. You've got the travel agents over there, right? Oh, we don't need that anymore. I've got Orbitz, I've got Priceline, right? You've got bank tellers. Now we can do everything online. You can take pictures of your checks and cash them online, right? You've got grocery stores down here at the very bottom. You've got retail stores, right? So these were some of the people who lost out. Although we still see all these things, they're not as prevalent as they used to be because of creative destruction. Here's one of the best examples right here. Okay, the winners beyond the winners beyond the obvious examples of programmers might be just as numerous. The entertainment industry, and I'm trying to make sure you get a good picture of all these people. Hey, you see me right there in the middle of Snoop Dogg and 50 Cent and all that. The entertainment industry was turned upside down by the internet, but its need for creative talent and product remains the same or greater, right? So it doesn't mean that talent goes away. It doesn't mean that the need for new products goes away. It just means that there's got to be greater innovation, right? So we've got to keep getting rid of the old. But watch this, right? The Super Bowl, which I believe that last year's Super Bowl is probably one of the best Super Bowls I've ever seen. These are, if you saw the stage, if you saw kind of how they did, these are all people who've been around a long time. But why do they keep, why are they able to stick around, especially for like Snoop Dogg right here? Why is he able to keep sticking around? Well, number one, they make great products, and their music has lasted, right, a couple of generations. In some case, Mary J. Blige, Eminem, Dr. Dre right there, right? But why do they last? Because they're able to innovate on there, right? Like they didn't come out dressed up like they came out of the 80s or 90s. They came out in the 2022 Super Bowl, and they looked like they were living in 2022. These people that you're seeing in front of me right here are able to consistently create new, right, and even build on what they've done before. Okay, the internet destroyed many small business, but created many new online ones. Let me see if we have anything next. Okay, so that's the end. So the idea of creative destruction, I'm gonna stop the share here, is constantly getting rid of the old, constantly bringing in the new, right? You don't want a closed system. You really don't want, well, you don't want an isolated system for sure. You don't want a closed system. You want an open system. Here's the question I have for you for this week as we talk about this mental model. Okay, in your leadership roles that you have, okay, where do you need to do some work? And here's the question I mean, okay? And maybe you're not fully in charge, but maybe you see something in one of the teams that you lead. Where is a closed or isolated system in your current organization, and what could be done, whether it is that you do it or someone else does it? What could be done to create an open system? What new needs to be, what new needs to come in, and what old needs to be released from it? Okay, so again, here's the question. Okay, in your current system that you're currently in, your place, where is the isolated or closed system? Okay, and what could be done to create from that isolated or closed system to make it into an open system? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. There are in the questions. If you have any questions for me, feel free to reach out. Thanks so much for listening. I'll see you in the next video. Have a great week.